The harvest assembly at Thornwick Village was lit with tallow candles that smelled of old grease, and every farmer on the Cresswell estate had come because they had been told to come, which was not the same thing as choosing. Nell Ashby stood near the back wall beside her brother Tom, her hands folded inside her second-best gloves, and watched Mr. Dover set his papers on the draper's table at the front of the room as though he were arranging a sermon. He was not a man who needed silence. He commanded it by occupation alone. Nell had known for 3 weeks what the papers said. Dover's clerk had made a copy of the notice and slid it under the kitchen door in the rain, which struck her as unnecessarily dramatic for a document whose contents she had already understood by the middle of August. The Ashby tenancy on 12 acres of mixed arable and pasture at the eastern boundary of Cresswell Park had been in arrears since March. The late Thomas Ashby, deceased 14 months, had fallen behind in the bad winter. The estate required a decision before Michaelmas. A decision, in Dover's vocabulary, was not a question. She had come because she would not send Tom in her place, and she would not stay away, as though she were ashamed. Dover cleared his throat and began with the general announcements. The things about drainage, and the tithe allotment, and the question of the mill road. And Nell let the words move past her. She was watching the far corner of the room, where a man stood who had not been at any prior assembly she could recall. He was tall, and lean in a way that suggested he had not always been lean, his dark coat too plain for a gentleman and too well cut for a tradesman. He held a glass of the indifferent ale and did not drink from it. He watched Dover with an expression that was not quite boredom. It was closer to the look a man wore when he already knew the answer to a question being asked too slowly. She looked away when Dover said her name. He did not look at her when he said it. He looked at his papers. The notice was brief and formal, and it named every sum her father had failed to pay and every sum she herself had failed to pay in the 14 months since, and when he finished reading it, the room had gone quiet in the particular way rooms do when something unpleasant has been confirmed rather than announced for the first time. Lady Dover, seated at the front beside her husband's empty chair, turned just far enough to find Nell in the crowd. Her expression was composed. It was the expression of a woman who had anticipated this outcome and had made arrangements accordingly. Her lips pressed together once, the smallest acknowledgement, and then she turned back. "No recourse," Dover said. "The tenancy lapses at Michaelmas. The land reverts." Nell looked back at the corner. The man in the plain coat was looking at her now. He dropped his gaze before she could hold it. She was not sure afterward whether she had made a sound. Tom's hand found her elbow in the press of people. She let him steer her toward the door. The night air outside smelled of turned earth and wood smoke, and she stood in it for a long moment with her hands at her sides and her chin level, because she would not be seen to do otherwise. The assembly rooms were still lit behind her. She could hear the low resumption of voices inside. She walked home. If you have stayed with this story before you have heard it properly begin, stay a little longer. This is where it starts. Everything that came before the assembly, she was already carrying. You will want to know what she was carrying. Her father, Thomas Ashby, had been the kind of farmer who understood land the way some men understood weather, with a physical certainty that was not quite knowledge and was more than instinct. He had farmed the 12 acres on Cresswell Park's eastern edge for 23 years, under 2 successive tenancy agreements, both renewed without difficulty because he paid on time and left the ditches clear and kept his hedgerows maintained in the way the estate preferred. He was not a prosperous man. He was a careful one. And careful men sometimes look prosperous until the one winter that finds the crack in the walls. The crack, for Thomas Ashby, had been the winter of 1810 to 1811, when the ground froze hard through February and the barley germination failed, and he borrowed against the spring to get through March. The spring was not what he had needed it to be. He fell behind. He did not tell Nell how far behind because he was a careful man, and careful men often confuse secrecy with protection. He died of a lung complaint the following October, not dramatically, but in 3 days, as things often ended, too quickly for any arrangement to be made in time. Nell was 23. Tom was 16. He was tall and narrow-shouldered, and he worked with the single-minded seriousness of a boy who understands that he must grow into his gravity rather than commanding it yet. He did not argue with her about the farm. He did not argue with her about anything, which she sometimes found harder than argument would have been. She had gone to Dover in November. She had laid out what she knew of the debt, which was less than what she would discover later, and made a proposal that she thought was reasonable. A reduced payment through the winter, full resumption in spring, the arrears discharged across 2 years. Dover had listened with his pen held loosely in 2 fingers and told her he would put her proposal to the estate. He did not mention that the estate's principal, Viscount Cresswell, had been absent from England for 3 years, and that the stewardship of his affairs had therefore passed in practice, if not in formal law, to Dover himself, who had a plan for the eastern 12 acres that had nothing to do with the Ashby family. Lady Dover's nephew was a young man of 20 with no agricultural experience and considerable social ambition, and the 12 acres would make a tidy parcel for someone looking to acquire a country foothold. These were considerations Dover did not mention to Nell. She learned of them by degrees, the way one learns most things in a village, through the particular economy of kitchens and market days, and the conversations that paused precisely when she came close enough to hear them. She learned in March that Lady Dover had told the rector's wife that the poor Ashby girl was holding on past the point of good sense, and that the decent thing would be to take the notice rather than prolong what could not be saved. The poor Ashby girl. Nell had heard it twice before Dover's clerk confirmed it in March, both times from behind her. She had not turned around. She put her head down and kept going, which was the only thing she knew how to do with anything. The night she found the man in the barn, she had not slept well, which was not unusual. It was the 3rd week of September, 4 days before Michaelmas. The night was cold enough to be honest about itself, and dark enough that she took the lamp rather than trying to manage without it. She was not afraid of the dark as a general principle. She was afraid of missing something that mattered, which was different. She heard him before she saw him, a breath, ragged and controlled in the specific way of a man who had been controlling his breathing for some time, which is to say, the way a man breathes when he is in pain and does not want to be heard. She held the lamp at the level of her chin and looked. He was half-propped against the far wall of the barn, between the last of the straw bales and the partition that held the 2 dairy cows. He was wearing a riding coat, dark brown, and breeches that had seen considerable hard use, and his right hand was pressed to his left side in the particular way that told her, with the cold certainty of someone who had nursed her father through 2 bad winters, that there was a wound beneath it. He looked up at her. His face was angular and pale with the specific pallor of blood loss and weather, dark hair pushed back from his forehead in a way that suggested it had been done by hand and not recently. His eyes were gray. Not kind. Not unkind. Level, in the way of a man who has trained himself not to let his face give anything away before he has decided what he wants to give. He said, "I am not a thief." She said, "I did not think you were." She set the lamp on the partition hook and went to look at the wound. It was not good, but it was not, she thought, fatal if it was kept clean. Something had opened the flesh at his left flank above the hip, had been improperly dressed, had ridden open again in the saddle. He had a horse then. She asked where the horse was, and he told her the other barn, the field-side one, with the gate pulled closed. She did not ask how he had come to be wounded. He did not volunteer it. These seemed to her, at 3 a.m. in a cold barn with a man who was losing blood at a pace that could not continue, to be the correct priorities. She said, "Can you walk if I help you?" He said with a brevity that she would come to recognize as characteristic, "Yes." She put him in the tack room off the main barn, which was the warmest small space on the property, and brought the kit she kept for the animals, and which served, in country practice, for people equally well. She cleaned the wound. He made no sound that was not entirely private. She dressed it with linen she could not entirely spare, and told him not to move more than he had to. He said, "How long have you worked this land?" "All my life," she said. He considered this. Then he said, "I am sorry to have landed in your barn." She looked up at him. His face was pale and composed, and there was something behind the gray eyes that she could not name yet. She would name it later. At 3 a.m, she only thought, "He means it?" She told Tom in the morning because Tom would notice and because she did not keep things from Tom that affected the safety of the farm. Tom looked at the tack room door for a long time and then looked at her and said, "And you mean to keep him here?" "Until he can ride," she said. Tom was quiet for another moment. Then, "Does he mean us harm?" She had thought about this. She said, "No." Tom nodded. He went out to the morning's work. She spent her last good coin that day, the 6pence she had been keeping against the winter, on surgeon's liniment at Rudd's apothecary counter in the village. She told Mr. Rudd it was for one of the cows. Rudd was a small, neat man who had known her father and who looked at her for a moment as if considering a second question, and then chose not to ask it. She walked home with the liniment in her apron pocket and the cold October sun on her neck, and thought about how little she had left and felt, despite everything, surprisingly calm. He healed with the particular focus of a man who had done this before, meaning he did not fight the healing or rush it. He ate what she brought him, slept when she told him to, and was upright by the second afternoon. He did not tell her his name until the second day, and she did not ask. When he did tell her, it was without emphasis, as if it were a fact rather than an introduction. "My name is Edmund Harwick," he said. And then, a beat later, Viscount Cresswell. The stillness in the tack room lasted the length of a full breath. Nell set down the bowl she was carrying. She looked at him. He looked back. His face told her nothing except that he was watching what her face did, which she found, to her own faint surprise, more interesting than alarming. She said, "This is your barn." "Yes," he said. "And your land." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. The coin she had spent on the liniment sat in her mind with particular weight. The arrears. The notice. The 12 acres of eastern field that Lady Dover's nephew was apparently already arranging his life around. She said, "Then you know about the Ashby tenancy." He said, very level, "I have come to learn about a great many things I should have known sooner." He said it without self-pity, which was the only way she could have heard it without turning away. She picked up the bowl again. She did not ask him what he intended. She was not, she decided, in a position to press the question. And there was something in the set of his jaw that told her the question was already pressing him from a direction she could not see. He found her at the table again that evening. She had not invited him out of the tack room, and she had not told him not to come, which perhaps amounted to the same thing. Tom was in the upper field with the cattle. The kitchen was lit with the low, warm light of a single good tallow, and the smell of the stew she had been stretching since Tuesday. And he sat down across from her at the table where her father had sat every morning of her life. and for a moment she had the disorienting sense that the farm itself was reordering around this man's gravity. He said, "Tell me about the boundary markers." She looked up. He said, "The eastern field. Dover's man moved them in July." "How do you know that?" she said. "Because I can see them from here," he said. "And I walked the boundary line on military survey maps before I left England 3 years ago, and they are not where they should be. Unless the field grew." She had not expected the joke, small as it was. She looked at him for a moment with an expression she could feel on her face, and could not quite control. She told him about the markers. She told him about the arrears and the proposal she had made to Dover and the answer she had received. She told him about the letter from Lady Dover's nephew that had arrived, inadvertently, at her door in August, addressed to Dover, the letter she had resealed and sent on, but not before reading the salutation that confirmed what she had already understood. He listened. He did not interrupt. His hands were flat on the table, both of them, which she would later think was unusual in a man with something to manage inside him. When she finished, he said, "You should have been told the estate had no agent with authority to make that decision." She said, "Perhaps. I was not told." He nodded. He was quiet for a moment, and she had the feeling, distinct and not comfortable, that he was deciding something in the silence, rather than resting in it. He said, "How long since your father died?" 14 months, she said. He said, "I am sorry." She looked at her hands. She said, "Because it was true." And because she did not know yet how much of the truth he could bear from her without misreading it. He would have liked that you could see the fence line from here. He always said a man who paid attention to the edges of a thing understood more about the middle than any survey could show. He said nothing to that. She looked up and found him looking at her with an expression she could not classify, except that it was not the expression she had expected, which had been sympathy or condescension. The two things people most often offered her since October of the previous year. It was closer to recognition. She looked away first. She told him she needed to check the barn before dark. The morning of the 4th day, she went to the eastern field boundary before Tom was up, because she wanted to walk it alone in the mist, as she had been doing once a week since July, noting each moved marker and the distance it had been shifted, recording the measurements in the small notebook she kept in her apron pocket. It was her evidence, if evidence was ever something she could use. She did not know he was watching. He had risen early, still careful on his feet, but steadier. And he stood in the shadow of the barn doorway with his coat pulled around him and watched her move through the gray morning mist from marker to marker, kneeling at each one, measuring with the knotted cord she carried, writing in the small book, rising, moving on. She was methodical. She was unhurried. She did not look around for witnesses or approval. She did what needed doing in the way a person does a thing they have decided to do, regardless of who is watching, which meant she would have done it the same if he had not been there at all. He stood in the barn doorway for a long time after she had gone back inside. He had not expected to find this. He had come back to England meaning to sell the estate as quietly as the law permitted and discharge his obligations to a place that felt to him like a debt he had been servicing too long. He had come back carrying the particular flatness of a man who has mislaid his reasons for the things he is supposed to care about. His wife, Clara, had been dead 2 years. He had not been there when she died. He had been somewhere in Spain where the intelligence was wrong and the road was worse, and by the time the dispatch reached him, she had been in the ground 3 weeks. The neighbor who wrote the letter had told him, with the particular kindness of someone who does not know how much kindness will cost, that she had called his name at the end. He had not been there. He kept a small leather cartouche, tooled with the Harwick crest, that he had carried through the peninsula and back. He had carried it because it was compact and useful, and because Clara had pressed it into his hand the morning he left and said, "Bring this home." He had not looked at it much. He had simply kept it on his person because laying it down felt like a decision he had not made yet. The cartouche was not in his coat pocket. It was not in the tack room. He searched for it without urgency, having established by now that misplacing things in a farm with 2 occupants who were not prone to theft was different from losing them, and on the second morning of his illness, he had seen Nell pick it up from the barn floor and turn it in her hands in the lamplight, reading the crest, and set it on the low shelf above the partition without comment. It had stayed there. She had not asked about it. He looked at it each morning when he rose. He did not move it. In the evenings, he had begun helping in the ways she did not refuse, which was a smaller category than he had expected. She refused his help with anything she thought she could do faster alone. And she was right about most of those things. She did not refuse him at the table, where they sat in the evenings with the lamp between them, and she did not refuse the conversation that grew around it, which was not, he found, the conversation of 2 people in an impossible situation. It was the conversation of 2 people who had both been careful for a very long time, and were finding, with some difficulty, that the other one was also capable of it. He said one evening, when Tom had gone to bed and the kitchen had gone quiet, "You are angry with me, not personally, as a class of person." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I am not certain that is unfair." He said, "No, it is not." She looked at him across the lamp. His face was, she had decided, a more complicated face than it first presented. It had a quality of held attention that she had at first read as coldness and had since revised. The jaw was set, but not rigid. The gray eyes watched things carefully, and without the superiority she had expected from his rank. Or perhaps what she had expected was what she had learned to expect, which was not necessarily the same. She said, "What are you going to do about Dover?" He said, "What would you like me to do?" The question surprised her. She had not expected to be asked. She thought about it honestly. She said, "I would like the boundary to be walked by someone with authority, and the markers restored, and the documentation signed by a solicitor with the estate's seal. I would like the arrears recalculated from the correct boundary date. I would like the tenancy renewed." He said, "Is that all?" She looked at him. He was not mocking her. She was quite certain he was not mocking her. She said, "That is a great deal." He said, "It is a fair accounting." There was a pause in which the lamp between them guttered slightly in the draught and steadied again. His hand moved on the table, one of those small, involuntary progressions of a few inches toward her, and he seemed to become aware of it and did not complete the motion and did not withdraw it either. It lay there, open, equidistant. She said, "You could sell." He said, "I know." She said, "You were going to." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I was. I am less certain than I was." She did not ask him why. She was aware, in the particular way the body knows things the mind has not yet organized, of how close his hand was on the table. She was aware of the warmth coming off the lamp and off him, combined, which she acknowledged to herself with the precision of someone taking a true inventory. She was not a girl who manufactured things she did not feel. She did not manufacture this. She said, "I should go and bank the fire." He said very quietly, "Nell." It was the first time he had used her name without the formality of Miss Ashby, and it landed in the kitchen as a different kind of statement than anything else he had said. She looked at him. His expression was, for once, entirely unlocked, the gray eyes direct and without their usual management, and what she saw in them was not what she had been careful not to hope for, and was exactly what she had been careful not to hope for, at the same moment, which was not a comfortable thing to discover in a kitchen at 10 in the evening with the lamp burning low. She said, "We should sleep." He said, "Yes." She went and banked the fire. She did not look at him again before she went upstairs. She lay in the dark for some time listening to the sounds of the farm settle, and she thought about the cartouche on the shelf in the tack room, and about the way a man who had been careful all his life could put his hand flat on a table and let the distance close. She thought she would not sleep. She slept. The harvest assembly at the Thornwick Rooms fell on the 28th of September, the last Thursday before Michaelmas. And Nell went to it knowing what Dover intended, and carrying that knowledge in her chest, the way one carries something heavy and breakable. She had said nothing to Edmund about the assembly. He was, by his own reckoning, recovered enough to ride, and she had understood by the third day that he did not mean to reveal himself to Dover or anyone in the village until he had decided what that revelation should accomplish. She respected this, or she told herself she respected it, which was not the same as finding it easy. Tom wore his good coat. She wore her second best, which was her only decent one, and the gloves that needed restitching at the left thumb that she had restitched that morning with the smallest stitches she could manage. She had known, walking in, that Edmund would be there. She had not told herself she had known this, but when she saw him in the far corner with a glass of ale and a civilian coat she did not recognize, she understood that some part of her had looked for him before she looked for anything else. He did not look at her. She looked away first. Dover's proceedings were what they had been: the mill road, the tithe, the drainage committee. Then her name. The notice was read. The sums were named. The 12 acres and their disposition were laid out in Dover's careful administrative language, which had the quality of a door being shut very quietly by someone who has checked 3 times that the latch will catch. Lady Dover turned in her chair at the front and found Nell in the crowd, and the expression on her face was the one Nell had seen in the market in August, composed and final. The poor Ashby girl. Lady Dover had said to Mrs. Harker, the draper's wife. Not a quarter hour before Nell arrived, her voice carrying in the anteroom as voices do when their owner does not particularly wish to be quiet. She has fought for it longer than anyone expected. I will give her that. Some fights cannot be won by character alone. Nell had heard this from the doorway. She had come in and found her place near the back wall and stood there. Now she stood in the same place, and heard Dover conclude, and heard the silence that followed, and she did not look at Edmund in the corner. She had decided, in the 40 seconds after the notice was read, that she would not look at him. She had done what she could. The 12 acres were her father's work, and her work, and Tom's work, and she would not stand in a room and watch the man who owned them choose to do nothing and find it in her face when he looked for it. She looked at Dover instead. He was gathering his papers. Someone coughed. A woman near the front whispered something to her neighbor, and Nell caught the shape of it, the syllables that formed the poor thing, and did not turn to see who had spoken. Peg, the kitchen maid who had been passing drinks from the anteroom, had come to find Nell just before Dover started, with pink cheeks and the urgency of a girl carrying information she thought was both important and possibly overstepped. She had said, I heard Lady Dover say it again, just now in the kitchen passage, to Mr. Fenwick. She said the poor Ashby girl ought to have taken the first offer in June, rather than embarrassing herself through the autumn. Nell had said, Thank you, Peg. That was kind of you to tell me. Peg had looked at her with the searching look of someone waiting to see if she was going to cry, and then had gone back to the anteroom. Nell had stood through the mill road, and the tithe and the drainage committee, and the notice and the silence, and she was still standing when Dover closed his leather case, and she looked at Edmund in the corner exactly once. He was looking at his glass. She found Tom's elbow, and they went out into the night. The air was the same cold, honest air it had been on the night of the first assembly, and she stood in it again, and this time did not stand as long. She said to Tom, "I am going home." Tom looked at the lit windows. He said, "Nell." "Go home," she said. He went. She walked. The track between the village and the farm was one she knew in the dark without the lamp. And she took it at a pace that was not hurrying and was not deliberate, simply moving the way one moves when there is nowhere to arrive that is different from where one is leaving. The arrears could not be paid. The tenancy lapsed at Michaelmas. Lady Dover's nephew would come with his agricultural ambitions and his clean boots, and he would walk the 12 acres that her father had walked for 23 years, and that she had walked for 14 months alone, and she would be someone who had once worked this land. She heard the sound of a horse behind her on the track. She did not turn around. He was, she decided, a man she had spent 4 days taking care of on her own premises at considerable private cost, a man who had sat at her father's table and eaten her stretched stew and laid his hand on the table not quite close enough to matter, and who had stood in the corner of an assembly room and done nothing while Dover read her name off a list of things the estate was repossessing. He was the Viscount Cresswell. He was the man whose barn she had been tending the wounded stranger in. He was the man she had been careful not to hope for. She did not turn around. He came up beside her and kept pace, the horse walking, himself leaning slightly from the saddle. He said, "Miss Ashby." She said nothing. He said, "I need you to come back to the assembly." She said, "I have heard quite enough of the assembly." He said, "Yes, I know. I need you to come back anyway." There was something in his voice that was not a request and was not quite a command, and was certainly not an apology. She walked 3 more paces, and then she stopped. She turned to look at him. His face in the dark was familiar by now, the angular planes of it, the gray eyes that watched carefully. He looked at her with the same directness he had shown at the kitchen table, the same lack of management, and she understood that he was asking her to trust a thing she had no particular reason to trust. She said, "Edmund." He said, steady, "I know what I am asking." She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she turned and walked back toward the lights. He rode beside her and said nothing else, which was one of the things she was coming to understand about him. He did not fill silences he thought she needed. The assembly rooms were still occupied, the low hum of conversation resuming as they often did after a proceeding, people clustering near the fire and the ale, and the particular relief of business concluded. Dover was near the front with Rudd, the solicitor, in what appeared to be a conversation about conveyancing. Lady Dover was seated with Mrs. Harker. The nephew, Nell noticed now that she looked, was present as well, a young man in new boots standing near the window, with the expression of someone waiting for a formality to complete. Nell walked in. She stood near the back, as she had before. Tom appeared at her elbow from somewhere and looked at her, and looked at the door, and looked back at her, and said nothing, which was the correct thing. He walked in behind her. He was still in the road-worn civilian coat. Worn. He had not changed. He had not ridden to the estate house to dress, which she thought later he had done deliberately, though she could not have said precisely why she thought so. He walked to the center of the room, and the quality of his movement, which she had noted on the second day when he was still half-mended, was the quality of a man who had learned to occupy space with economy rather than display, which had the paradoxical effect of commanding more attention than display would have. Dover looked up. Edmund said, in a voice that was entirely level and carried to the back of the room without effort, "Mr. Dover." I am Edmund Harwick, Viscount Cresswell. I have been in England for 6 days. The room had been finding its way to quiet for the preceding sentence. It arrived at quiet now. Dover's face underwent a sequence of adjustments. The most interesting of them was the one that came just after the recognition, the brief contraction of something that was not quite surprise, and was more like recalculation. Lady Dover's fan had stilled. Edmund said, "I have reviewed the Ashby tenancy and the boundary documentation for the eastern field. I have also reviewed the correspondence between the estate agent and the interested parties regarding the reallocation of that tenancy. I would like Mr. Rudd, as the estate's solicitor, to confirm in this room what I will now state, that no agreement regarding the reallocation of the Ashby tenancy has been entered into by the estate." Rudd looked at his papers. He looked at Dover. He looked at his papers again. He said, with the careful diction of a man choosing his syllables, "That is correct, my lord. No agreement has been signed." Edmund said, "The tenancy is renewed." He turned then, not dramatically, simply turned and looked at Nell. The room turned with him, because rooms follow the attention of the most consequential person in them, which was a phenomenon she had always known theoretically and found in practice considerably more affecting. He said to Nell, in a voice that was entirely public and entirely steady, "Miss Nell Ashby holds this tenancy and holds it with my name." The room did not erupt. It did not need to. Lady Dover's hand had resumed its movement, fanning very slowly, and Nell could see from 20 feet away that the composure on her face had a slightly different quality than it had had before, the quality of composure that is doing more work than before. The nephew in the new boots was looking at the window with the expression of a man revising a plan he had not quite finished forming. Dover said, with the remnant of a man who is not yet certain he has lost, "My lord, there are arrears of record that must be addressed before any renewal can be formalized." Edmund said, "They will be addressed. The boundary markers will also be addressed. Mr. Rudd will hold both instruments. I will speak with you tomorrow morning, Mr. Dover." It was not cruel. It was exact, which was more effective and somewhat less kind. He came to her then. He walked the length of the room toward her, not quickly, with the same economy, and Tom stepped back without being asked, which Nell thought said a great deal about Tom. He said, "Lo, will you walk with me?" She said, "Where?" He said, "To the eastern boundary. I would like to see it by lamplight." The room was still in the particular way of a room that is pretending not to be listening. She was aware of this. She was also aware that she had been walking the eastern boundary alone for 14 months, and that being asked to walk it by the man who owned it was not the same thing as any arrangement she had imagined, and also not entirely unlike what she had imagined, and that both of those things were true at once. She said, "Yes." They walked out together into the cold night air, and Tom appeared behind them with the lamp, and she took it from him and pressed his hand briefly, and he went back inside. They walked the eastern track without speaking for some time. The mist was up again, thin and cold, and the lamp made a small warm sphere around them in it. She could see the first of the boundary markers, and she stopped at it and held the lamp lower. He crouched beside it. He put his hand on the stone and moved it, a small test, feeling for the depth and the angle. He said, "This has been moved 18 inches west." She said, 22 at this one. I measured. He looked up at her. The lamplight fell on his face from below, which was not a flattering angle, and was, she thought, the most honest one she had seen him in. He said, "Show me the notebook." She took it from her apron pocket and gave it to him. He turned the pages. He read each entry without hurrying. At some point in the reading, the expression on his face changed in the way that faces change when something that has been closed opens, and she watched it happen and did not look away, because it seemed to her important that someone see it. He said, finally, "You have been doing this every week." "Since July," she said. He was quiet. He turned one more page. Then he closed the notebook and held it out to her. He said, "You should have this back. It belongs with you." She took it. Their fingers touched at the exchange. Briefly, hers cold from the night air, and his, she found, warmer than she expected. He said, "I am not going to sell the estate," she said, because she did not trust herself to say more yet. "Good." He said, "I have been carrying the wrong reason for being here. I came back to put things down. I think I may have found a reason to pick something up instead." She looked at him. The mist had thickened slightly, and the lamp was doing more work, and his face in the warm light was the face she had been tending for 4 days without knowing whose it was, and had known for 2 days, and had spent one night telling herself did not matter. She said, "Edmund." He said low, "Nell." She looked at the lamp in her hand and the cold dark beyond it, and the 12 acres of her father's work that were, at least for now, still hers. She looked at him. She said, "There is something in the tack room that belongs to you." He said, "I know. I have been leaving it there." She said, "Why?" He was quiet for a moment, his hands in his coat pockets, his eyes on hers. He said, "Because I wanted to see if you would give it back when you were ready. Not before." She understood then what it meant. Not the cartouche itself, which was a small leather object with a pressed crest and a worn strap. What it meant. She understood what he had been waiting to see. She said, "Come back to the farm and I will return it." They walked back together through the mist. The farm came into view as it always did at night. First the glow of the banked kitchen fire through the lower window, then the darker shape of the barn and the outbuildings against the sky. She had walked this view for 23 years, first with her father and then alone. And she walked it now with someone beside her, and the quality of it was different. Not easier, not simpler, but different in the way things are different when the weight has been redistributed and what had been heavy becomes possible. She lit a candle in the tack room and took the cartouche from the shelf where she had left it, and she turned it in her hands once as she had turned it the night she found it, feeling the tooled crest beneath her fingers. The Harwick mark worn smooth where a thumb had pressed it over years. She carried it to the barn doorway where he stood, and she held it out. He looked at it in her hand. Then he put his hand over hers around it. He did not take it. He held her hand closed around it, both of their hands together over the small worn thing, and the barn behind him was lit from inside with the light she had brought, warm against the cold dark. And the mist moved outside in long, slow drafts across the field. She said nothing. He said nothing. The lamp cast its light through the open door, and outside the first stars were visible where the mist had thinned. The eastern field lay in the dark, its boundaries marked and remeasured, its evidence held in a notebook in her apron pocket. In the morning, there would be solicitors and documents, and the particular work of making permanent what had been established in one assembly room in one evening. There would be the question of what happened next, which was a question she had been asking for 14 months in the dark, and had not, until now, heard any answer to that she believed. His hand was warm on hers. She thought of her father, who had understood land the way some men understand weather, and who had believed that a man who paid attention to the edges of a thing understood more about the middle than any survey could show. She thought he would have looked at him on the eastern boundary in the mist, and then looked at her and said nothing, which was his way of saying what he thought, when he thought it mattered. Edmund's thumb moved once, very slightly, across the back of her hand. She let him keep it there. The barn was warm behind them. The field was dark before them. The cartouche lay between their clasped hands, its crest against her palm, and she did not let it go, and neither did he. And the night settled around them both as nights do when the worst of what they held has already passed. If this story moved you, leave a word in the quiet below. This is what it means to be found.